Linda, thank you so much for joining us for this ASP chat. We've been looking forward to speaking with you this week.
Well, thank you for inviting me to do this. This is exciting.
Right now, ASP is focusing on the transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration and President Biden's first 100 days in office. Starting with you, you have been nominated to be the U.S. ambassador. First off, can you just tell us what that job is and a little bit about what the responsibilities are as a U.S. ambassador?
Well, first and foremost, as the U.S. ambassador, and there's another title to the position, you're the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations. In that position, you represent the United States in this multilateral fora. You are a member of the Security Council. You make up and represent the United States as one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And you carry out the policies that have been established by the administration. And for me, it will be the Biden administration.
The UN ambassador is a position requiring state confirmation. Can you walk us through the nomination process from the time you're nominated to the time you're sworn in?
So you start out with filling out lots of questionnaires that come from the Senate that ask you everything about your life from the time you're born. And they use that questionnaire as a way of getting to know who you are. During this process, I have also met with a number of senators. Some of them I know because this will be my 4th time going through this process. I went through the process as the U.S. ambassador to Liberia. I went through it when I was nominated to be Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Personnel and the State Department. I also was nominated as the Assistant Secretary for Africa. So this is my 4th. And then as you start to prepare, it's like preparing for an oral exam. I have a huge briefing book, which usually is sitting on the table, but I cleaned off my desk for you guys. I don't want to lean over and grab it. But I get a big briefing book with a lot of Q's and A's on what our policies are and issues are that could come up during the process. And I study that night and day. And I've gone through a couple of sort of test booths where it's test hearings where I have people playing senators and asking me tough questions and seeing if I know the right answer. And eventually I have the real hearing where I sit in front of members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And many times there are issues that are important to particular senators. On this, everyone is interested in the issue of UN reform. And so they'll ask for my views and the administration's policies on those issues. And I'm nervous. I'm always nervous. It's like adrenaline. You need the adrenaline to make sure you're prepared and you're comfortable. So I have this healthy sense of nervousness about it. And then when you're sitting there in front of the senators, they can be tough. They ask tough questions. They ask tough questions about your life, things that you don't remember. And you think you put it all on paper and you might get this question. So we saw that in 1974, you gave a speech in front of your class in which you talked about the UN. What are your views on that now?
Wow.
So speaking of that, this is obviously not your first foray into foreign affairs. You've worked under the Bush and Obama administration. But going back to sometime in the 70s or before, you grew up in a small town in Louisiana, I believe. How did that inform how you deal with the rest of the world, and how will you bring how you learn to deal with the rest of the world to your current position at the UN?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, when I was growing up, this was not a part of my reality. I didn't know there was such a thing as the United Nations and diplomacy and foreign policy. When I was in 8th grade, Peace Corps came to my little community. There was an old historical Black college that closed down, and they used the facility to train Peace Corps volunteers who were going to Somalia and Swaziland. And that was my first introduction to the world beyond my hometown. It was my first introduction to the world beyond segregation and racism. And it definitely had an impact on me. And the world is a small place, because as I went through my career, two of the people that I engaged as an 8th grader in that program where they allowed the little kids from the community to come and learn a language, and I was taught Siswati. And don't ask me a word because I don't remember it. But I love going to that classroom every afternoon after school to learn Siswati. The Siswati teacher ended up going to graduate school with me at the University of Wisconsin. And in my second job in the Foreign Service, my boss happened to be one of the Peace Corps volunteers in training there. And he said to me, "Where are you from in Louisiana?" And I always say, for people who don't know where I'm from, that I'm from Baton Rouge. And so I said, "I'm from Baton Rouge." And he said, "Well, I'm from Baker." And I looked at him and thought he was just joking because he happened to know that I was from Baker. And he said, "No, I studied there. I did my training as a Peace Corps volunteer." And I suddenly said, "You were the owners of these 2 Siamese cats, Rachel and Michelle. My family took those cats when you left to go overseas." And so it just shows you how small the world is.
Sure. We recently spoke to a former National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, about all the classified information that gets passed from one administration to the next. As the government switches party power, what does that handoff look like between you and your predecessor?
Well, that too is an interesting question. So before I was nominated for this position, I was head of the State Department's transition team, which was working to prepare Secretary-designate Tony Blinken for his position. And so we were engaging with the State Department on issues that require the attention of the new administration. And it wasn't an easy process because it was not a friendly, initially, because the administration didn't accept the results of the election. The relationship was not as smooth as it could have been. But since that time, and now that I'm nominated, I have spoken to my predecessor twice on the phone. I'm scheduled to speak to her again tomorrow. And we've had an amazingly warm and hospitable relationship moving forward. A lot of the classified is only inside the mission, so we can't talk about those things on the phone. But there's a huge briefing book that I know has been prepared for me by the State Department with the handover of her information. I also had the opportunity to speak to Nikki Haley, who was her predecessor. And I've spoken to Susan Rice and Samantha Power, as well as Ambassador Pickering, who was there some years ago, and to John Bolton, who was there. And I think they all feel the sense of wanting the office to be successful. Thus, they want me to be successful. Our policy preferences and our policy approaches will definitely be different. But I think in terms of being representatives of the United States at the UN, we all have the same goal of exerting U.S. influence.
Speaking of policy, in the first 100 days, what of the Biden administration's foreign policy agendas are you going to be focusing on? What are your priorities?
Well, President-elect Biden has kind of laid out a broad list of priorities. One will be looking at the economy and how we bring the economy back. The second is COVID and how we address COVID moving forward, how we address the pandemic moving forward. The third is racial justice and how we deal with issues of equity as we move forward.
Which policy are you most eager to address in your new role?
Well, of course, all of them. The pandemic is front and center, but at the United Nations, my responsibility will be to reassert U.S. leadership in the United Nations. The Trump administration was not very forward-leaning on the role of the UN and engaging with the UN. So for me, my absolute first priority is to reassert our leadership and then to reassert our values for democracy, for human rights, for humanitarian assistance, press freedoms. All of those are priorities that this administration has made very clear are important to the administration as it moves forward. And I will be standing tall for those issues at the United Nations. There are a huge number of policy issues, of course, that will be important. How we engage with the UN on issues of Israel. The Biden administration has made absolutely categorically clear that we will stand with Israel, that we will fight against any efforts to undermine or diminish Israel's role in the United Nations, and we will be pushing back hard on any resolutions that target Israel or question Israel's right to exist. We will be pushing back on the Chinese, who have really asserted their role in the United Nations in terms of pushing their own agenda. And their agenda certainly is not an agenda that is one that we would be comfortable with. We will be pushing for more Americans being hired in important positions in the United Nations, both at the entry level, but also at senior levels. So we have a huge platform to work from, but we also have a huge agenda. I have a great team in New York that will include 4 other ambassadors, a deputy permanent representative who's there already, and then 3 ambassadors who will be working on issues at the Security Council, working on economic and social issues, and working on issues related to management and reform.
I have one last fun question for you. In some of our research that Chris and I did, the gumbo kept coming up, and you making gumbo around the world. And I was just wondering if you could explain to the world how gumbo ties to your approach to foreign policy.
You know, I always tell friends, if I had a choice in life about what I wanted to be, I probably would have been a cook, because I come from a long line of cooks. My mother was a cook. My grandmother was a cook. My aunts were cooks. So cooking is very much a part of my makeup, and I love cooking. And so I always use my cooking skills to facilitate my diplomacy. If people are sitting at a table with a good meal, it's easier to talk to them about tough issues. And if the food happens to be really good, it makes them more comfortable talking about issues. And if you cooked it yourself, and that was always something, I mean, even at an early stage of my career, I always cooked the meals that I wanted people to enjoy at my house. But even as I became an ambassador, you know, I would have the president of Liberia to the house to have gumbo that I had prepared. And sometimes I would even take people into the kitchen and give them the hard work, like chopping the onions. And so when you've done all of that with people, you can have a conversation with them that is not uncomfortable for them. You kind of sync up with people when you prepared the meal for them, and they've helped you prepare the meal, and you even serve it. So it makes people comfortable. And so I always did that with gumbo. And someone said to me as I was describing this one day, it's gumbo diplomacy. And I loved the terminology, so I took it and I've used it. So I kind of just inculcated my upbringing with my profession, and they have worked to help me succeed.
That's great.
That's wonderful.
That's great.
Linda, thank you so much for taking the time. We know it's a busy time for you. It means a lot to us and our viewers. Good luck with the confirmation process, and thanks so much for joining us on this ASP chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and wish me luck in my hearing. I'm nervous.
Good luck. Good luck. Bring gumbo.
That's a good idea.